Welcome to Behind the Educator's Lens, the podcast where we explore the stories, strategies, and shifts shaping today's classroom. I'm your host, Robin Young, and today's episode is all about transforming the way we teach writing. If you have ever heard a student groan, ugh, when it is time to write, our guest is here to help flip that script. I am thrilled to welcome Melissa Morrison, a writing consultant and literacy expert who's on a mission to drive instructional change and increase literacy outcomes. Her motto, changing to yay at writing time. Melissa supports teachers in creating joyful, purposeful writing experiences that meet students where they are, and she has the results to prove it. Before we dive in, though, let's start with something fun. Welcome today, Melissa.
Thank you. I love that intro. Thank you so much.
Well, you've done a lot of great work, and in our home, we love to write.
Yay.
So somebody like you is just like the apple of our eye in this home.
Good.
So I always like to start with a round of this or that to get to know you a little bit better beyond the questions that are more formal. So
Okay.
let's break the ice with a quick round. All right. So are you an early bird or a night owl?
Neither.
Afternoon is
just
your
like
prime
to-
time?
I just like to sleep. So I don't want to get up early, and staying up late does not happen very often.
Well, I do love a good nap. I get you. Paper planner or digital tools?
Paper more so. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like with the writing process, there's something about the feeling of the pencil on the paper.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, conferencing one-on-one or peer editing groups?
One-on-one.
You get a lot of good information in the one-on-one. And finally, the most important question on my podcast, Star Wars or Star Trek?
Gosh, I'm sorry to say that I don't like really either of them, and I don't even know that I've watched either very much or very thoroughly. So I'm
That's okay.
so sorry. Do
That's
you need to end the conversation now?
No, but that's always so funny because that's always the dividing question as to what's going or
Right.
not. But that's okay. I completely get it.
Good.
All right, well, let's get into it. Melissa, what first inspired you to specialize in writing instruction? And what patterns were you seeing in classrooms that made you say this needs to change?
Yeah, I would say that I was originally inspired when I had coaching myself in writing instruction. It was in all of literacy, but I went into writing instruction quickly because I had just started the workshop model. And so having a coach to really help guide me through it. And then it got even bigger when I was given the units of study and writing to pilot in my classroom. And I just like learned so much from those books. And also, the children just did so well. It was just like a new way of writing and teaching writing. And so that was my biggest inspiration before I was even doing this work. So as a classroom teacher, that was my inspiration. And then when I started as a literacy consultant, at first I was doing reading and writing, but I think my passion is just more in writing because I can see how much better it can be than it usually is. How much more fun and enjoyable it can be. And then also just that teachers, this is one aspect of literacy that there is not much training on. When you go to school for teaching, you don't learn much about it at all. And the focus is on reading so much. So I just love to be able to help teachers feel more confident because usually they're like, I feel like I don't know how to teach writing. I don't like it. The kids don't like it. So I just want that to change.
I love that. I think that writing is such a vital aspect of our human identity. And I think it's important to feel that beautiful connection to it rather than like, I don't want to do this. And I think that comes a lot, like you mentioned, from us not knowing how to do it. And that piece really is missing from teacher education, which, along with reading instruction, I find that those two big pieces we must do as teachers. But those are not things that are actually taught to us during the teaching program.
Yep. And I don't know why it's not happening. I don't know why it hasn't been just overhauled. And I'm sure there are some colleges, universities who do a better job than others. I'm sure there are. But it's just, especially now, I mean, I only hear that talked about a little bit, that the pre-service programs and the training is not addressing all of the actual parts of teaching literacy.
Yeah, I think some of my biggest lessons in teaching college were like how to get the attention of the class. We had a whole page on that. And then lesson planning from who you are as a person,
Mm, mhm.
necessarily what the kids need in front of you.
Right, right, yeah.
Yeah. So I've done a little bit of a deep dive into some of your podcasts, and something really interesting that I'm hoping you can speak to is I saw something about authentic writing experiences as
Mhm.
opposed to a more like compliance-based model of teaching. Is this something you subscribe to? And
So, absolutely. It's something I believe in. I think there's no other way to build students as writers without it being authentic. And even though you have to teach them certain things as far as being able to answering prompts and preparing them for any tests they might be taking, or even, you do your college essay, or sometimes when you're applying for a job, you have to answer questions. And so we have to prepare them for that. But if you want to be successful as a writer, you need to know how that works for you. But then also as a young student, and not so much kindergartners and first graders, because they'll be authentic. You give them a pen and paper or markers, they will write, and that's
Mhm.
very authentic for them. But if you want them to be interested in it and think that there's meaning to it, it has to mean something then.
Mhm.
It's not just about, so I always say it's not about the product, it's about the writer, which I really got from Lucy Calkins. She says teach the writer, not the writing. And I think it can be kind of confusing because you think, well, no, I am teaching them how to put things on paper and how to be successful as a writer, but it means that you have to find what they need and what they already have as a writer. And so, we also know that engagement is one of the most important factors in learning, period. There's a lot of research on that. And so when it comes to wanting to write, you have students who, my son doesn't want to write. He's an eighth grader now, but he's
Mhm.
never wanted to write. That's not a thing. He doesn't read either, unfortunately. He's way into sports. And so if I want him in his classroom to engage in writing, I have to find a way to make it meaningful for him.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's true for any of us. So it has to start there. It has to be purposeful, meaningful, and making it authentic. And to me, that means that it's something that you are engaged in. It's authentic to you, meaning it has purpose, but also authentic, meaning that it's yours, it's the students and not the teachers. And I
Mm.
think that's what happens too when it's product focused. Is like, I'm just going to make sure that everything is in place as the teacher to make sure that by the end of this, your paper looks the way I think it should look. And so that's not authentic, right? That's just trying to get it done. And so I also think authentic means like they're doing it on their own, completely on their own. So that I think that's another big part of it being authentic.
At what age do you think that kids can start to write authentically on their own?
Pre-K.
Pre-K.
Yeah, I mean that's where it starts, right? So when your little toddler is at home coloring or drawing or whatever, and then they hand you it and say, I made this for you, or I made you a card, or I wrote you a letter, that's authentic. And so what they're able to do as a writer at that time is coming through. And then also it has meaning for them because they wanted to write it for you. So the audience is part of that connection and that meaning. So yeah, it starts from there. And so I think, often think that students have to be able to do something in particular, like write their letters correctly in order to be writers, but that's not true because we start as writers. Every little
Mm.
mark on the wall. I remember, I think that's in a book I read. They mark on the wall. That's them being a writer. And so we have to realize that there are stages of writing development, and that's where it
Mm.
starts with just making a mark, and then that mark eventually turns into something else, and something that is, the common way of us making marks on the page, the real letters that we're trying to make. But writing also is about composing. And so It's about actually putting things together and having ideas and understand that you can communicate them. And that can be in a form of pictures too. That's the first way that a lot of young writers do write and do compose. And we have to remember that that's part of it too. And that can happen from the very beginning.
Yeah, those that's actually one of my favorite things about child development is watching how they start to express themselves through picture and then slowly through text. And I know you mentioned your son who has not necessarily loved writing. And I totally relate to that. In my home, my little guy has been very busy from the start. And so I started thinking about ways that we could do some authentic writing at home. And I found one of those little jam boards that you can press the little garbage can and all of the
Mhm.
text disappears.
Mhm.
Because part of it for him, I think, too, is like when he makes a mistake, he
Yeah. Yeah.
gets really frustrated and fixated. And so last night I wrote him a little note on the board and then put it beside his bed, thinking that when he would wake up, he would see the note. And last night I was sitting down here and I heard some little footsteps. And I went
Mhm.
up to my bed last night and on the little jam board it said, I love you so much, mom and dad.
Oh.
And I think for me, I just like welled up with tears because this is a kid who he doesn't like to write. And I can imagine him being in his bed with each little letter trying to scribe that little note of love. And
Mhm.
that's the piece of authenticity that I think that needs to be built on to grow his love of writing because then he
Mhm.
sees that writing in his world could actually be a communication between two people that's
Right.
nonverbal. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And so, you did exactly what I want teachers to do. I want them to notice what's happening and then provide a tool that could be helpful that isn't making them do anything or making them do it in a certain way. It's just providing the tool that they need. And so, like, you gave him this idea that oh, we could write back and forth on this board and I
Hmm.
can erase it really easily too. So, like you said, he worries about mistakes. So that's nice, for him. But then and it's also promoting this idea of what writing can be and what it's
Hmm.
for, right? So you are putting that into his mind and giving him the tools to be able to do it and then allowing him to explore that. So it's non-threatening and low stakes and all of that. And that's what's such an important part of writing too. And then that could move on to something else. Then he might actually start to feel okay to put it on a paper and give it to you as a letter. So that's exactly what we want to happen. And I think that it's hard when, you have older students, like you think about these eighth graders, I think about my son going to eighth grade and trying to teach them to want to write. And it's like they don't really need to, like they text on their phone. Well, we have to accept like that's a way to write. Texting is a way to write. Not that you're going to let them sit in class and text, but like they could type a text, on paper or on their computer. Like you gotta find things that are meaningful for them and use them as ways to springboard into something else, I think. And
Hmm.
that reminds me of like when my daughter was younger. So they have 4 years between them. My daughter's older. And I remember she was going away with her friend one day. And so she wrote her brother a note, saying like, I'll see you later and be good for mommy. And it's like she wanted to do that, right? She was
Yes.
thinking like she was leaving before he was going to wake up and she wanted to tell him this. So we have to just find the things that are meaningful.
Yeah, and I know that one of the things that I've heard a lot is that teachers are often just told, oh, just they'll get better by if you just let them write more. But I don't think that's necessarily the truth. I think that we need, like you mentioned, to give them some tools to make it low stakes. Are there any practical shifts that you've seen that help to make writing more joyful and effective instead of just more?
Yeah. So, and I want to say that, I do think that getting students to write more, but in a good way, right? So
Okay.
in a good environment, and like you said, with low stakes, I think that does actually improve writing. But you are going to need some things to help them along the way. Some little tidbits, some lessons, some ideas, some, something to get them moving if they're stuck in a way. But the act of writing often, so if we think of more as being often, and consistently, that does improve writing. But we know that that's never really in a vacuum, because when you're in school, you're learning something. Like there's still
Mm,
reading going on, and all these things are happening. And so you are, that improvement in writing is not isolated just because they're writing. It's because of all the other things they're also learning. However, I do believe that them consistently writing and getting more into it is going to improve them. And as far as practical things to do, I think just if you are not having them write in an authentic way, such as like from the beginning on their own, right? So a lot of times we give graphic organizers that are already showing like, okay, the lead goes here and the three body sentences go here, or the three facts that you need for your informational piece go here. And I think there's a lot of ways that those things can be utilized, but I think they have to be used after having informed, like being informed as a teacher, right? So we talked
mm,
about you deciding to do this for your son because you knew the things that you knew about him as a writer. And so we have to allow students to write authentically on their own from the beginning. Like you need to know what they are capable of before you can make choices as to how you're going to support them.
mm,
And so, like, if you're going to give them this pre-structured planner, some of them you might be holding back because
mm,
you're putting them in this, this is the way you have to write it. And then some of them you're pushing further than they're able to go. And so I think that's a big thing too. It's so eye-opening for teachers when you just let them write and you see what's going on. And then that's not just going to be about what they're putting on the page. It's also going to be how engaged they are, how interested they are, how they feel about themselves as a writer. All these things are going to come up. And that's what you need to know. Those are all
mm.
the things you need to know about them as a writer. So I really think that's one of the biggest things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love a good graphic organizer, and I hadn't
Mhm,
thought about it that way, that it does organize you.
mhm,
And that is both a plus, and that is also something that can not work for
mhm.
everybody and makes them feel restricted from the start.
Right. And I think that what's helpful, we all, when we write something, depending on what it is, are going to plan it in a different way. Right.
Mm,
So, like us as knowledgeable writers, as knowledgeable as we may be, depending on what we're trying to write, it's going to be planned out and written out in a different way. And then, if you and I have the same, I hate to use the word prompt, but like if we're both going to write the same thing, whatever
mm,
it might be, we individually are going to plan it out in a different way. And so we have to remember that, like you said, not everyone is going to want to organize in that way. And so we have to teach them different ways to be able
mm,
to get themselves ready. But for some, and I know for me, I don't do any kind of planning. I write. I just write. And then I backtrack into,
mm,
let me organize my thoughts, right? And so I think that can happen a lot too. But again, I think often comes a lot from this focus on the product. Like, but I want them to make it look a certain way at the end. And so I have to start here. But really, you have to start where they are and then figure out how to help them get to where you want them to be, like how you want that end piece to possibly look, if that makes sense.
So, walk me through then, if you're in a classroom and you're wanting to do a lesson on writing, what might that look like to start the kids off in the class if they are all needing different things or different supports? How do we start a writing session from one place, but allowing them all to enter it
Hmm.
where is beneficial for them?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different entry points for writing, as Matthew Glover likes to call them, and it really depends on the grade level. And so, but if I think about in the beginning of the year, you're starting your classroom, regardless of what grade you're in, I want it to be this idea that the teacher is putting out that like you are already a writer. Like I'm not teaching you how to be a writer, you are
Mm,
a writer. So it's like, okay, writers, we're gonna get started with some writing. And then depending on the grade level, it's wanting to like be excited. I can't wait for you guys to get started. Maybe have to do a quick little talk about what are the different things you could be writing, depending on the grade level. So in kindergarten, honestly, it's like, hey, you guys are writers. We're going to do some writing. Let me show you my writing. Here's your paper. Go write. And that's really as easy as it is. And then in the older grades, where you have to kind of, especially when they're so used, if they're not used to writing in this way, it's going to be really hard for them. They're going to think that they don't know how to do it or they can't come up with an idea. And then it's just really realizing that this might not happen right away. There
Hmm.
might be students who actually don't write or don't want to write and, have a lot to work through. And so it's like I can't decide or expect that every student is going to write something today, but that's okay. Because just like it would be okay for you, if I asked you, Robin, I want you to go do this for me, you might not be able to do it, or it might take you
Hmm.
a while. And so we have to allow them to be human. And so, anyway, it might take some time. And we just have to kind of remember that our job is to find out where they are. It's not to
Hmm.
push them to get something done, it's to find out where they are. And then, once writing time is up and going, and let's say for the most part, you do have everyone writing something, then it's just really gathering information. And this can happen if you start a unit that's like, we're going to write a narrative, or if you're starting with, you guys write whatever you want, and you might have done some lessons that say there's this type of writing and this type of writing and this type of writing, just to kind of get them to realize what they can do. But let's say they're all up and running, everything's writing, then or they're writing, everything's, going okay. Then you're taking some information like, okay, I want to know how many of them even understand what they're doing right now. Like, how many of them
Hmm.
even know what kind of writing we're doing, or how to get their ideas going, or I want to know who's engaged, or I want to know who can write, a whole page of writing. And again, this is different for every grade level. But you kind of think about, what do you want to know? Let me go around and get that information. And then when you actually have that information, so I try to use a really simple spreadsheet where you can just put like a plus or minus or a question mark or a check mark under each category. So I like engagement is a category, like whatever it is you're trying to look for. And then when you can look at that as a class and say, okay, I have a whole bunch of pluses in this column, I think we're pretty good, but I might need to talk to or figure out this one and this one. So it's trying to, without going crazy as a teacher, thinking, oh my gosh, I have to give everyone a different graphic organizer and everyone. No, you just have to figure out where they are as a class, as individuals, and then figure out, okay, what is the thing that I need to do to help them? And it might be a whole class thing because a lot of students are struggling with something, or it might be a small group thing, or it might be an individual thing. I feel like I've said a lot. So what questions do you have?
I feel like, well, these things are complicated issues, so it's hard to be concise about. We
Yeah,
know that when you get a class of learners, they are not in the same place. They have
right.
different experiences. They might be multilingual learners. They might have, maybe they have not spoken yet verbally. So we have this wide breadth of students in our class, and so I think these answers are not simplistic
Right.
because the clientele that we're working with is complex. We have such
Right.
a wide scope. And I think that's why it's why it is a challenge to teach writing. It's why it can be hard. And I wonder, like, are there any pervasive myths that you wish you could bust about writing and get rid of them forever?
Yes, for sure. I just have to, like, pick a couple. I think even if it's not like an explicit, like you hear it out there, I think the feeling that we have in our head as teachers that I have to get them to do blank.
Yes.
I think that's one. And I know that we have standards that we're supposed to meet, but that doesn't mean they're all going to do that. Right? They're
Hmm.
not all going to necessarily do that. And so we have to move them like from where they are as close as we can get them there. So I think that idea that I have to get them to do blank is why teachers want to give these graphic organizers. And it's why they want to make it simple. And it's
Hmm.
why they want to control what everyone is doing. It's one of the reasons why. But that's not the point. The point is that we are helping these students become writers
Hmm.
and continue to grow in skill.
Right.
And we have to find, again, like just like your son, what is stopping them, basically. And so if we give them, I keep going back to this isn't the only thing, but if we give them that pre planned structured organizer and we hold their hand along the way, we're going to make sure that they get something on the page and it's going to look somewhat like we want it. But did they actually learn how to be a writer? And so that's what we want. We want them to learn how to be a writer. So you need to know what they're actually capable of, and you need to stop having this worry that like, oh, but I have to have produced, they have to have produced something so people can see that they're writing something. But then when they leave you and next year's teacher asks them to write independently, are they going to be able to do it? You know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one. And then just going back to when we said sometimes we think, well, they have to be able to do this, this, and this before they can write, before they're actually a writer.
Mm-hmm.
I would want to get rid of that. And one of those big ones now that people are some very prominent literacy experts, I guess I could say, are saying that they have to write sentences before they can write anything else. And I definitely disagree with that. I did a whole episode about it because even for older students, it's not that they don't need to learn how to write sentences well, but it's that again, we compose. Like there's a lot of stuff that has to do with writing besides just transcribing the words. So you can't ignore all of that. So that's why I want them to just do what they can do. And then I try to teach into that and try to improve things. And then when it comes to the younger students, again, it's about all the parts of writing, it's composition, it's transcribing, it's all of that. And that doesn't happen just in sentences. It doesn't just happen like a letter to a word or word to a sentence. It also happens because we're telling a story and we have to learn how to
Mm-hmm.
do that. And so there's so many parts of it. So if you limit your kindergartners, let's say, to just learning how to write a sentence, you've ignored so much more when it comes to writing.
Yeah, I always like to say, try to get into the mind of the writer, especially when they're little. Things like they might miss a period, or they might have used invented spelling rather than the correct spelling pattern, but you as the adult can still read what they
Right.
wrote. So maybe
Right.
instead of boat, Boat, they spell it Bote.
Right.
And it's very interesting because I think in discussions with some adults, they're like, well, then what is that word? I'm like, well, you know what that word
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
is. I
Yeah.
think what we need to pay attention to is the message that they are trying to convey
Mm-hmm.
and trying to understand where they are. And then we can come alongside them and say, hey, this is actually the spelling pattern. So we can just go back. And but that's not the part of your message that I loved. It
Mm-hmm.
was you talking about being on a boat and you having this adventure. And that's the piece that is really important, is for us to also to remember they're just trying so hard to tell us what's inside of their little hearts and minds, and that if we come at it from a critical lens rather than an empathetic lens, I think we miss the nugget of what writing is actually supposed to be. And I know you talked about different modes of doing it. And I wrote a book this year myself, but I didn't write it. Yeah, I didn't write it on the computer, though I wrote it with my mouth.
Yeah.
That is also one way to write, is actually voice to text.
Right.
And sometimes we need to process aloud and then we can move it into the actual letters and sentences. But that is also a process of writing, is to talk. If you're somebody that maybe, like I find sometimes it's too much, like my pencil can't keep up with my brain. And I
Mm-hmm.
do find that a lot with boys too.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to generalize, but I find that some boys can be very busy. And
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes if they start with a voice to text and they can just like get out all of the words that they're thinking about, and
Mm-hmm.
then they can start to compose.
Absolutely. And I think we need to realize, I think it always comes back to realizing what it is actually like to write, And
Yeah.
so if you don't do writing on your own very much, and a lot of teachers don't, I didn't when I was teaching, you forget. And you
Hmm.
just expect them to be little robots that do everything in a certain way. And I get that. But yes, I think that we have to allow them to try different things. And we're living in a world of technology. And I will never say don't have them write on paper. But I think for the exact reason you just shared, they need to see that they have the ability to tell a
Hmm.
story, to teach something, to give their opinion. And so if that's the way they can start, and then now if it's transcribed, then they have it there, this piece of writing,
Hmm.
right? And then they can look at it and make improvements and changes. And had a teacher I worked with that was in a self-contained special education classroom, and she played around with that a lot. Sometimes she wanted them to start from scratch writing on pen and paper. Sometimes she had them do speech to text and then they would edit or revise from there. And then sometimes I we would say, well, what if they do speech to text and then they write it?
Mm.
Even if they start with pictures. I mean, so these were students who were in like third or fourth grade, but they were really reading on like a first grade or kindergarten level. And, so it was like, okay, here's your story. I don't want you to copy what's on there, but I want that was almost like they're planning, right?
Hmm.
Telling it verbally, which is oral rehearsal, right? That's huge. But even though it's transcribed and they can see it, but now I want you to try to write it. But yes, I love how you said that they still have that inside them, but just because they have trouble transcribing it doesn't mean they can't have it completed. Doesn't mean that they're not a writer. So
Hmm.
yeah, I do think we need to let them have access to whatever tools are going to help, and it doesn't have to be forever or the only way that it happens.
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. But as you say that, I can't imagine completely writing a book with speech to text. And I do agree. Like, I'm the same for you where I start to write and my writing is so messy because I just can't get it down fast enough. And so I have to kind of play around with how, like, sometimes it's on the computer, sometimes, it's on paper, but I have to at some point be writing with my hand.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Um, I actually did my English degree out at SFU, and that was the first real time where I had to look closely at my writing, and I found it to be very interesting that a lot of the way that I naturally write is I would say one thing and then I would say the next thing, and those things actually needed to be switched. So yeah, but that was me trying to do it in the moment, and then along with voice to text, it really helps me to organize what's going on. And so I know that that's been something that I've brought into the classroom, and I don't use it forever, but I do find that the attitude, that UG piece is like, okay, well, if I have an entry point here, I know that I can start from here and then I can get better. So it
Mhm.
helps to improve that attitude, I think, over time.
Absolutely.
One more question for you.
Okay.
I always want to talk a little bit about teacher overwhelm. How do you think educators can make these changes this September without adding more onto their already full plate?
Yeah. It just my heart goes out to these teachers. There's so much that they're dealing with that they don't have to deal with. That's the thing of it. Things that they don't have to be dealing with, but they're dealing with it anyway. You know, it's always difficult to change something. That's always difficult. It doesn't even matter if it's going to make your life easier. The mental load of trying something new is always difficult. And so I almost think I can't say that it's not putting something else on your plate. However, I would say that it is going to make it better. Like it
Hmm.
is going to be worth the change. So, everyone has a different program or curriculum that they're following for writing. I would start by looking at what are you actually asked to do in writing? Because sometimes we assume what we're supposed to be doing or what they expect or how it's supposed to be graded. Sometimes we assume these things. We don't actually know. And what I find, unfortunately, more often than not, is that there isn't anything that they've told you to do. There are no rules, there are no expectations. And so that's one thing I would say. Just figure out how much freedom you actually have, and then also remind yourself that no one is going to be good at this when they first get started, because that's one of the things that I find that teachers think, okay, I'm doing this. Melissa has told me all these things to do, so now I'm going to do them all perfectly, and every kid is going to succeed. And that's what we do as teachers, but that's not true. And I have to say, no, hold up. Like, you can't implement all of these things at once. You have to give yourself grace. Eduardo Briseño talks about, he wrote the book, The Performance Paradox, and he talks about how you have to give yourself time to learn. Like, you have to be in the learning zone. You can't always be in the performing zone, but teachers always want to be in the performing zone. And, I get it. They're expected to grow these kids every year. But unfortunately, we have to have time of learning where things might not go quite as well as you want them to, right? So you have to just allow yourself to be learning, but know that it's so worth it. It is so worth it. And so it's hard to really help with, when if I don't know what you're actually already doing for writing or what resources you have, it's kind of hard to say like how to use what you have, but also do this. It's hard to explain that. But I would just say take the pressure off
Mhm.
yourself and give it a little bit of time. Everything that you try, give it a little bit of time. I know it's so worth it. Like it's just so worth it to make these changes about the authentic writing for your students.
Yeah, I think authentic writing really sounds like that's the way to go if you want to
Thanks.
grow these kids, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so.
Well, if educators want to find you or work with you, where can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my website is called Teaching to Transform, and it has little dashes on either side of the two. And so you can go on there and message me. You could also find me on LinkedIn, Melissa Morrison, and just let me know any questions you have. Or, yes, if you would like to work with me, I would love to work with you. And then, of course, the podcast, Getting Students to Write. I love it. I was saying to Robin, it's so nice to not be the one in charge. I've enjoyed this
Yeah.
so much. But yes,
Melissa, I've enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I can tell that you're so passionate about writing, which I think is also a key there. For educators that are listening, I hope they can steal a little bit of your joy when it comes to writing so that they can turn the UG to yay in their classrooms. And to our listeners, if this conversation sparked a new idea or gave you something to reflect on, please share this episode with a colleague. You never know the ripple effect it might have. Until next time, keep looking behind the lens because the best classroom transformations start when we remain open to shift the way that we see things. Thank you so much, Melissa.
thank you. This is awesome.